When Florence Ballard first started having problems, Mary Wilson says, it wasn't because she was difficult, unstable, or irresponsible. It started much earlier, long before the public ever heard the word diva. According to Mary, Florence had been abused when they were still just neighborhood girls, barely teenagers, newly calling themselves the Primettes. They were 13 or 14, still in school, already learning that the world did not treat black girls or their bodies fairly. Florence carried that trauma quietly into the group that would later be renamed the Supremes. You think you know the story of the Supremes. You think you know the drama, the jealousy, the rise and the fall, the headlines and the betrayals. But Mary Wilson insists there is a chapter the world never heard because it didn't unfold on stage, or in Motown's offices, or in glossy magazine spreads. It unfolded in the dark. According to Mary, Diana Ross wasn't just haunted by guilt over what happened to Florence. She was hunted, and the spirit following her, Mary claims, wasn't some faceless stranger. It was Florence Ballard herself, the woman pushed out of her own group, the voice silenced, the life that spiraled into poverty and struggle while Diana rose to global royalty. Mary says Florence came back not as a simple memory, but as a presence Diana could see, hear, and feel. 5 times. 5 moments that Diana Ross herself allegedly could not explain, and if Mary is telling the truth, then what happened between these women did not end in 1976 when Florence died. It didn't end when the group split. It didn't end when Motown rewrote the narrative. It never ended at all. Chapter 1. The First Warning. 1967. The Mirror Incident. Before The Ed Sullivan Show, to understand how the haunting began, you have to go back to the winter of 1967, long before Florence Ballard's death, long before Diana Ross became a worldwide icon, and long before Mary Wilson realized that the past does not stay buried just because a record label needs it to. Mary says this was the moment she first saw genuine fear crawl across Diana's face. Not the fear of bad reviews, broken contracts, or shifting radio play. A deeper fear, the kind that hits when you see something you know should not be there. The Supremes were backstage at the Ed Sullivan Show, inside a machine built of bright lights, precise timing, and strict schedules. Runners rushed through the corridors with clipboards tucked under their arms, shouting cues and counting down minutes on stopwatches. On stage, it was polished glamour. Behind the curtain, organized chaos. But inside Diana's dressing room, things were strangely still. Mary remembers the gold-rimmed mirror, surrounded by a halo of round bulbs burning white-hot. She remembers the stale sweetness of hairspray thickening the air, making the room feel warmer than it had any right to be. She remembers the quiet click of the lock as Diana turned it, wanting a few minutes alone before showtime. Everything felt normal, until it didn't. Mary says she heard something first. A faint, sharp sound, like a breath catching in someone's throat. She thought it came from the hallway, and kept talking to one of the makeup artists. Then came a different noise. The soft scrape of Diana's chair moving across the floor inside the dressing room. Not loud, just enough to cut through the buzz and make Mary stop mid-sentence. When the door finally opened, Diana did not glide out like the composed star the world knew. She burst into the corridor as if the room behind her were on fire. Her eyes were wide and glassy, not quite focused on anything. The rims glistened with tears she hadn't fully let fall. Her breaths were short, and when she tried to speak, her voice shook in a way Mary had never heard, not during rehearsals, not during arguments, not even during the nights. Florence broke down from being pushed further and further out of the spotlight. "She's in there," Diana whispered. "Flo is in there." At first, Mary thought Diana meant Florence had actually shown up. Maybe Florence had slipped past security. Maybe she wanted to confront Berry Gordy or Diana or anybody who would listen. In 1967, the tension between Diana and Florence was already stretched to its breaking point. Jealousies, management decisions, power plays, and hurt feelings braided together like live wires. So Mary braced herself and pushed open the dressing room door, expecting to see Florence standing in the middle of the floor. But the room was empty. The bulbs hummed softly. The chair where Diana had been sitting was nudged slightly away from the table. No open window, no door ajar. Yet the air felt unnaturally cold, damp, in a way that didn't belong backstage. "Where?" Mary asked. "Where is she?" Diana didn't point to a shadow in the corner or to the floor behind the chair. She lifted her hand and pointed straight at the mirror. "She was behind me," Diana said. "Right behind me." Mary stepped closer. On first glance, nothing seemed out of place. Lipsticks lined in a neat row, powder compacts open but organized. A silver comb resting in its usual spot. But Mary leaned toward the glass anyway, because fear has a way of forcing curiosity. That was when she saw it. Not a face, not a full figure, just a blurred shape smeared into the condensation, clinging to the lower left corner of the mirror. The outline looked like a hand. Not sharp, not photorealistic, but clear enough that Mary felt something twist behind her ribs. Diana insisted she hadn't touched the mirror. She said she'd been brushing her hair, humming quietly, when she noticed movement behind her reflection, a soft figure, far back at first, like someone standing over her shoulder, but further away than the tiny room allowed. She spun around. Nothing. The space behind her was empty, but when she turned back toward the glass, the figure hadn't vanished. It had moved closer. Mary always emphasized one detail when telling this story, the detail that convinced her this was not just nerves. Diana didn't describe Florence as she looked that week. She described her as she had looked years earlier, around 1965, hair full and curled, lipstick bold, cheeks sharply defined. Wearing a shimmering rehearsal dress the three of them used to tease Flo about, because Florence said it made her feel like she sparkled. That version of Florence hadn't appeared on stage or in rehearsal for a long time. Mary tried to steady Diana. She blamed the lights. She blamed the steam from the curling iron. She reminded her that exhaustion, relentless schedules, and Motown pressure could make anyone's mind bend. But Diana kept shaking her head. "You didn't see her eyes, Mary," she whispered. She wasn't smiling. She was watching. What struck Mary wasn't only the fear pouring through Diana's voice. It was the guilt beneath it, raw, heavy, unfiltered, as if the presence in the mirror wasn't there simply to scare her, but to confront her, to remind her of every decision that had pushed Florence further out of frame, every moment of silence while Flo's star dimmed. When the stage manager knocked to escort them to the studio floor, Diana refused to walk alone. She made Mary go beside her, like a shield. Even then, she kept glancing back over her shoulder, eyes dragging toward the mirror every few seconds, as if she expected the glass to ripple again. It didn't. But sometimes the scariest thing isn't a ghost reappearing, it's knowing it could. Showtime came. Under the harsh, hot lights of Ed Sullivan, the Supremes delivered their performance flawlessly, every note in place, every movement polished, the glamour intact. But during the final verse, Mary noticed Diana's gaze. She wasn't looking directly at the audience. Her focus floated slightly above the crowd, slightly off-center, as though someone stood in the wings, not clapping, not cheering, just watching her. Mary never forgot that expression. Not fear, not anger. Something worse. Recognition. Because that night in 1967, Florence Ballard was still alive. She was somewhere out there in the world, battling private demons and public humiliation. Yet whatever Diana saw in that mirror, whatever she felt breathing on the back of her neck, whatever left that faint impression on the glass, it was not the living Florence. It was a warning. The first warning. And, Mary Wilson insists, it would not be the last. Chapter 2. The Night Florence Died, the 22nd of February, 1976. The voice in Diana's bedroom. Mary Wilson says she will never forget the sound of Diana Ross's voice on the phone that night, not the pitch, not the words, not the air between the syllables. It wasn't the polished tone of a superstar or the commanding voice of a Motown frontwoman. It was the small, cracking voice of a terrified child. "Mary, she's here. She's in my room." Those were the first words Mary heard when she picked up the receiver at 3:12 a.m. New York time on the 22nd of February 1976. If you have ever known a fear so deep it strips a person down to the bone, you understand why Mary still shivers when she repeats that sentence. Because at that exact moment, hundreds of miles away in Detroit, Florence Ballard was taking her final breath. The newspapers would later talk about alcohol, about depression, about a once famous voice fading away in a small house with no visitors and no spotlight. They would say she died quietly, but Mary has always believed Florence's spirit did not slip out of this world in silence. She believes it went straight to the one person Florence had the most unfinished business with. That night, Diana was staying in a midtown Manhattan hotel suite, one of those older buildings where the walls hum in the winter and the heat rattles through the pipes like coded messages. She had finished a long rehearsal earlier, returned to her room around 11, and tried to settle in. According to Mary, Diana was restless from the moment she arrived. She paced, she fluffed pillows that didn't need fluffing, she shifted flower arrangements a fraction of an inch. She checked the locks more than once. The air felt strange to her, heavy, charged, but she blamed it on nerves, exhaustion, and the cold wind outside. Just after midnight, Diana slipped into a silk robe and sat on the edge of the bed. That was when she heard it. At first it was only a faint humming, soft enough to ignore. Then the sound shaped itself into a melody clear, familiar, heartbreakingly distinct. It was People, the song Florence loved to rehearse back in 1965. The one she practiced over and over in studio sessions. The one she never got to sing for an audience because the spotlight slid away from her before she ever had the chance. Diana froze. She didn't turn to look around the room. She didn't reach for the television. She just listened, every muscle locked. The voice wasn't leaking in from the hallway. It wasn't drifting through the wall from the next suite. It was coming from inside her bedroom, close, positioned right behind her, as if someone were standing at the foot of the bed, singing to the back of her head. She whispered one word. Florence. The voice stopped. That was when the temperature changed. Diana later told Mary she watched her own breath fog in front of her face. A room that had been warm moments earlier suddenly turned sharp and icy. Goosebumps rose along her bare arms. The muscles at the base of her neck tightened. She felt something shift behind her, not a breeze, not a draft, but a pressure, as if the air itself had gained weight. She stood up quickly and walked toward the wardrobe, trying to convince herself there had to be some rational explanation. Before she could reach the door, it swung open on its own. Not violently, not like a movie scare. Slowly, deliberately, as if someone inside had simply decided to step out. That was the moment Diana ran to the phone. Mary says Diana's voice came through the line split in two, half whisper, half scream. She kept repeating the same words again and again. I hear her, I hear her, I hear her. She's here, Mary, she's here. Mary tried to calm her, told her to breathe, to turn on all the lights, to open the door and call security. On the other end of the line, Diana was shaking so hard she could barely hold the receiver. Something crashed, the sharp shatter of glass hitting the floor. Then, nothing. A long, unnatural silence stretched between them until Mary thought the connection had been lost. Finally, Diana's voice returned, thin and distant. Mary, look at the mirror. At first, Mary didn't understand. She wasn't in the room, but Diana, speaking in broken fragments, explained what she was seeing. While she was on the phone, while Mary was begging her to stay calm, a fog had started to bloom across the vanity mirror. It grew from the bottom up, spreading slowly, as though someone were breathing heavily against the glass. Then, in the mist, 3 letters began to appear. Not scratched in, not written with a finger, formed, as if the condensation itself had been pushed into shape from the other side of the mirror. Mary told her to get out, to put on clothes, to leave the suite, to call for help anyone. But Diana remained rooted in place, eyes locked on the mirror, voice nearly gone. She said she could feel Florence standing behind her, not touching, not speaking, just existing there with a weight Diana could feel in her bones, watching, judging, demanding something. She didn't feel rage. What she felt was worse. Sorrow, bitterness, accusation. The sense of a life cut short and a dream stolen, pressing down on her like another layer of cold air. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, the room shifted. The warmth seeped back into the walls, the fog on the glass thinned and vanished. The letters dissolved. The mirror returned to its ordinary, harmless shine. The presence was gone. But Diana knew what it meant. Mary could hear it in her voice, the way something inside her seemed to snap and unravel all at once. Florence was not just a name in her past. She was a wound. And wounds do not heal simply because one person moves on and the other is left behind. Later that morning, phones began to ring. Whispered conversations traveled through Detroit, then New York, then L.A. Motown executives spoke in low voices in their offices. Florence Ballard had died during the night, alone, broke, forgotten by the machine that once built her up. Mary Wilson believed Florence's spirit did not drift gently into peace. She believed it went straight to the person who had benefited most from her erasure, not to hurt her, but to make sure she understood, to demand to be acknowledged. The papers would call Florence's death tragic, Mary would call it furious. And Diana Ross, standing in a silk robe, staring at a mirror that no longer showed the letters she'd just seen, believed something even darker. That Florence Ballard had come to say goodbye, and to say, "Remember me." Chapter 3. The Motown Hallway, 1983. The footsteps Diana couldn't outrun. By 1983, Motown was no longer the glittering kingdom it had once been. The hits had slowed, the sound had shifted, and the center of gravity in music had moved on. But according to Mary Wilson, the building still had residents you couldn't see on any payroll. Not the literal ghosts people joked about in late-night studio conversations, but emotional ghosts, regrets, rivalries, betrayals that never made it into official biographies. The Supremes were long gone. Disco was fading. Funk and the early tremors of hip-hop were taking over. But, as Mary liked to say, ghosts don't follow trends. They follow the people who created them. And that year, during preparations for the Motown 25th anniversary special, Diana Ross found out just how closely Florence Ballard's memory had stayed on her heels. The reunion was supposed to be a celebration, triumphant, nostalgic, safe, a tribute to the label's golden era, a symbolic return to the place where it all began. Motown invited its legends back to Hitsville. Cameras, interviews, rehearsals, staged family moments. To Mary, the building felt like a museum of her youth. To Diana, it had always been a monument to her rise. To Florence, Mary believed, it had been something else entirely, the place where everything started and the place where everything broke. On the afternoon of the 20th of March, 1983, Diana arrived late. She wore sunglasses indoors, her energy sharp, jittery, almost electric. Mary says she noticed it immediately, the way Diana kept checking over her shoulder, the way her posture tensed as they walked through familiar hallways, as if she expected someone uninvited to be trailing them. They were headed towards Studio A. Down the same narrow corridor the three girls had walked hundreds of times when they were still unknown, still hopeful, rehearsing until their throats burned and their feet ached. At first, Mary was distracted, thinking about the show, the cameras, the tension that always came when history was being repackaged for TV. Then she realized the hallway was too quiet. No assistants rushing past, no engineers lugging cables, no chatter. Just the faint buzz of old fluorescent lights and the soft click of Diana's heels on the polished floor. Mary fell a few steps behind, walking with a young production staffer who had never met Florence Ballard, who only knew her as a name on a plaque. As they moved deeper into the corridor, Mary felt it. The air getting heavier, thicker. Not warm, not humid, just dense. Like the atmosphere before a storm breaks. The temperature dipped. Tiny hairs on her arms lifted. Then Diana stopped. She didn't slow down. She didn't hesitate. She froze so abruptly, the staffer almost ran into her back. Mary watched Diana's shoulders tighten. Her hand clenched more tightly around her purse strap. Her chin tilted slightly, the way it does when someone is listening too hard. For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the electrical hum overhead. Then Diana whispered, "Do you hear that?" At first, Mary didn't. All she registered was the silence. But Diana began to back up, 2 small steps, her eyes fixed on something behind Mary. Not someone. Something. "Flo's here," Diana said quietly. "I hear her heels." Mary's breath hitched. Because once Diana said it, Mary heard it too. Click, pause, click, pause. Not a booming echo, not a distant hallway noise. A close, contained sound, the sharp, Unmistakable strike of high heels hitting a hard floor. Slow, measured steps. The staffer tried to rationalize it. "It's probably somebody in another corridor," he said, glancing around, pretending the building's layout could explain what his ears were telling him. But Mary knew Hitsville's acoustics. She knew how sound traveled around corners, how it bounced off doors and walls. This wasn't drifting in from somewhere else. The footsteps were right behind Diana. Mary stepped closer. Diana didn't move. She stood rigid, her whole body trembling, staring straight ahead. The footsteps grew nearer, still steady, still unhurried, like a woman who knew exactly who she was walking toward. Mary turned around. The hallway behind them was empty. No one at the far end. No shadow in the middle. No door just closing. Nothing. But the sound didn't stop. It kept coming, right up to them, until Mary could almost feel the air shift next to Diana, that strange sensation of another presence lining up at your shoulder, the way Florence used to stand when they squeezed around one microphone. Then the footsteps stopped. They didn't fade. They didn't trail off. They just ended, as if the invisible figure had reached her mark. Diana's face drained of color. Her lips parted. Her eyes shone with a gloss that had nothing to do with stage makeup. "Mary," she whispered. "She's right behind me. I feel her. I swear to God, I feel her." Mary reached for her wrist, expecting to find normal warm skin. Instead, her fingers closed around something icy, so cold it felt like Diana had been holding a block of ice instead of a purse. It didn't match the building. It didn't match the day. It matched only one thing: the story they had been running from for years. The staffer, who had tried so hard to stay logical a moment ago, took a step back. He heard the footsteps. He saw the panic. He smelled it too, something faint and powdery, drifting into the corridor, riding the cold air. It was a scent Mary hadn't encountered in years. A soft, sweet perfume Florence had worn in their early Motown days. The same fragrance that had lingered in cramped dressing rooms and practice spaces when they were teenagers fixing each other's hair before shows. Diana smelled it as well. Her hand flew to her mouth, and a sound slipped out somewhere between a gasp and a stifled sob. "Mary," she whispered. "She never forgave me." It was the first time Diana had ever said those words out loud, a confession ripped open by footsteps no one else was supposed to hear. In that moment, Mary understood. This wasn't just about a ghost story. It was about a debt, a moral one, an emotional one, maybe, to Diana, a spiritual one. The staffer reached up and flicked the overhead switch, as if more light might make the impossible go away. The fixtures flickered, dimmed, flared, then settled into an uneasy, trembling glow. Not enough to pitch them into darkness, but enough to send a message something was interfering with more than just their nerves. Diana gripped Mary's hand like a lifeline. "We have to go," she said, her voice barely audible. "Now." They turned and walked back the way they had come, not running, but close to it. Mary swears she heard one more heel strike behind them, a single, deliberate step, like Florence was following just long enough to make her point. When they reached the main lobby, everything snapped back into place. The temperature lifted, the light steadied, the perfume vanished, conversations and background noise seeped in from other rooms. The building went back to being just a building. Diana leaned against the wall, shaking, trying to catch her breath. Mary stood beside her, heart pounding, telling her it was over. "Whatever that was," Mary said softly, "it's done." But Diana didn't agree. "No, Mary," she replied, staring down the hallway they'd just escaped. "That wasn't goodbye. That was a reminder." "A reminder of what?" Mary asked. Diana swallowed hard. "That I wasn't the only one who deserved the spotlight," she said, "and she knows it." Mary never forgot that line. She never forgot the footsteps either, because Diana wasn't the only one who heard them. Chapter 4. The Dressing Room Collapse, 1991. When Florence pulled the lights down, by 1991, Diana Ross was no longer just a singer. She was a brand, a silhouette, an icon. She was gowns and diamonds and magazine covers, the living proof of what Motown could manufacture when it chose one voice to crown. But Mary Wilson says something else had grown just as large in the shadows around her. A presence, a reminder, a shape Diana never called by name, she just called it her. To the rest of the world, Diana Ross still seemed untouchable, a woman who walked into any venue like it belonged to her. But Mary says that after the footsteps in the Motown hallway in 1983, something in Diana changed. The fear didn't crash in all at once. It seeped back slowly, like ink spreading through fabric. A pause at every doorway. A quick second glance at every mirror. A quiet tension whenever she walked hotel corridors alone. By 1991, that tension had hardened into something close to dread. The tour that year dragged them across Europe and back to the United States. The schedule was punishing. Travel, soundcheck, show, repeat.